because of a bad disposition.
So we know all these esoteric traditions, systems, etc., have for a long period of time, and including figures that were illuminists and including figures that were involved in the secret societies, would know that electromagnetic fields can influence the thinking of, could potentially influence the health of, and influence the behavior of other human beings. And so now that we've established this, I want to tie together the concepts of Kabbala with the concept of alchemy, and then we'll look at the research study as it relates to electromagnetic fields and how this could be utilized as a weapon against other human beings.
In many ways, alchemy and Kabbala are a match made in heaven, a beshert. Both understand reality as a series of dynamic transformations and correspondences with basically everything else.
Right off the bat, apologies for this guy's sort of, I don't even know if you'd call it feminine energy, but whatever this energy is, apologies for that. You can just search alchemy and Kabbala, and this video is probably going to be the first result on YouTube. So just FYI if you're wanting to find more of this type of information. But I don't think most people want to listen to this guy talk a lot, but we'll continue on just for the sake of the example that we're trying to flesh out here.
From the inner recesses of the Godhead to a single blade of grass, everything is connected in a vast, though as of yet imperfect harmony.
And that's sort of our first clue, imperfect harmony. And he's going to reference this multiple times over. So what's the thesis of Kabbala? The thesis of Kabbala is through human action, we're going to bring about a perfected world by basically bringing about the return of the Messiah, right? And this thesis evolved from the Talmud to the Kabbala, and then in the Kabbala you have the evolution into Jacob Frank, who's basically, we're going to invert all of the moral order in bringing about the Messiah. And so there's some question as to, in terms of the most powerful circles, what prophetic tradition are they following? And there's many arguments that can be made in that regard. But alchemy, of course, is purification of, baser minerals or metals or something like that. The metaphor being, well, we're going to turn them into gold, which is pure. And so you'll see this process outlined multiple times over. So we're trying to purify the world in a sense in both systems. And so, of course, if you watch my Kabbala and Talmudic lectures, their method of purifying the world essentially revolves around either eliminating or enslaving all the non-Jewish people of the world. Again, I showed a clip in the Talmudic lecture where the rabbi literally comes out and says, all the non-Jews you see, the billions, they're here to serve the Jews. So if you want to dispute that representation, go back and watch those lectures. So we're tying this concept of Kabbala, which I've talked on in previous lectures, with this concept of alchemy. And as we've already seen, magnetism and electromagnetic fields feature prominently in these esoteric traditions that often borrow from Kabbala. So we're continuing on now with that context active in our minds here.
Of course, it was precisely the task of both the Kabbalist and the alchemist to transform and heal this imperfection, a combination of metallurgy and messianism. Further, both alchemy and Kabbala are siblings in a sense, at least in the European theater. Alchemy was first introduced into Europe on February the 11th, 1144 by Robert of Chester, and the earliest Kabbalistic texts, such as the Sefer Bahir and the schools of Kabbala, appear in southern France and Spain at nearly the exact same time. Indeed, the crown of the Kabbalah, the Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, appears toward the end of the 13th century, and the first major European alchemical text, the Summa Perfectionis, also appears around the turn of the 14th century. If you're interested, I've made episodes on both the origin of Kabbala and alchemy in the European theater. Check out some of my playlists on alchemy and Kabbala if you're interested in those topics. Given all this, you won't be surprised to learn that alchemy and Kabbala became deeply connected in later literature. In this episode, I want to explore a text in which both alchemy and Kabbala are perhaps most deeply synthesized, along with at least a dash of magic.
So now we're getting to this combination of where the magical sort of element enters into this stuff, which of course is always something that raises eyebrows a little bit, but let's continue.
This text is the wonderful Eish Metzaref, or the refiner's fire. Here we find alchemical preparations, metallic correspondences with the divine emanations or the Sephirot, magic squares, and the idea that nature and the divine reflect and refract one another in one vast totality. Before diving into the text of the Eish Metzaref, let's say a little bit about what I mean by both alchemy and Kabbala. Here I'm referring to alchemy as the attempt to understand the nature of, well, nature through an experimental process largely under an Aristotelian framework, along with what is called the sulfur-mercury theory of the metals. That theory was that the metals themselves were formed deep within the earth through a series of exhalations which conditioned some ratio of sulfur and mercury, resulting in the various metals in various states of impurity, such as lead and tin, or in certain states of purity, such as silver and gold. The task of the alchemist was to unlock the secrets of this process and heal nature, to use their language.
Again, above and beyond just converting things into gold, healing nature, same sort of Tikkun Olam concept in Kabbala, and it involves a transformational process on matter. It transforms matter, right? Just making sure that we're on the same page here before we get in directly into the frequencies.
Resulting in the ability to transmute metals one to another, to create universal solvents like the alkahest, and to produce elixirs which could greatly extend life. What I mean by Kabbala, on the other hand, is a form of theosophical speculation about the nature of the divine, the various realms of existence, and especially the relationship of the divine to this realm. This form of theosophy is especially interested in the 10 Sephirot, or a series of dynamic divine emanations which serve as both moments in the divine dynamism and the bridge between the utterly transcendent divine and the divine immanent to our realm of existence. Importantly, Kabbala is very tied to Jewish scriptures, down to the very letter. I mean, really down even to the very shape of singular letters of the Hebrew text. So scripture is not only a narrative of history or legal codes, but also a map of the divine dynamism itself. To be sure, both alchemy and Kabbala are much more complicated than this. Alchemy and Kabbala are, in many ways, ideally suited to be combined, or at least put into conversation with one another. In fact, alchemical ideas appear in the Kabbala as early as the Sefer Zohar, or the Book of Radiance, the most important text of the Kabbala. There we have a sustained passage which provides a theory of the origins of the metals based on the cardinal directions and the Aristotelian elements, similar to the standard alchemical accounts of the time, though with a distinctly Kabbalistic twist.
So, just making it clear here, these ideas are not tangentially linked, or they're not linked in that there was a bunch of people like Cagliostro that were practicing both Kabbala and alchemy or something like that. They are explicitly linked. It was obvious that these two processes had similar goals.
At Zohar Volume 2, 23 base to 24 base, we learned that there are 4 primordials, or Kadma'e. These are something like polar directions of the universe. Further, there are 4 elements, or Yesodin, fire, water, air, and dust, which basically correspond to the basic metals gold, silver, copper, and iron. Why dust and not earth, you might ask? Because in the Hebrew Bible, it is the dust, or the Adamah, out of which the human being emerges. Thus the term has a sense of fecundity in Hebrew. In the Zohar, it is the dynamic relationship between the Kadma'e and the Yesodin which produce the primordial metals, which in turn produce further elements.
So for those that aren't familiar, in the story of Genesis, God basically creates Adam out of the dirt or the dust, right? And so in Kabbala, Adam is referred to as Adam Kadmon, which was this perfect being that was without flaw until their version of the fall, in which there's the shattering of the vessels, etc., etc. I discussed this in my Kabbala lectures. But what we're seeing here is the beginnings of alchemy as it relates to the human being. Not the metals, but human beings themselves. And that's the process that Kabbala wants to get involved in. And this works both ways. This Kabbalistic process works both forward and backward, from the engineering of the human being to the engineering of the metals to the engineering of physical reality. But this dirt or dust element has replaced it. Why? Because it has a specific significance in Jewish thought to be the component that makes up the human being or takes on human form. And you can see, of course, where we're going with this and what we've already touched on with electromagnetic fields. But let's continue here.
Again, what's keen about the Zohar's understanding of the origins of the metals is that it's all about a dynamic series of relationships rather than a single moment of fixed creation. I should also mention that there is a wonderful section in Volume 1, 249 base that talks about how Solomon became so famously wealthy. In this account, David, quote, perfected the moon by singing to it, thus causing it to rain down transformatory light, which transmuted the dust of Israel into gold, thus explaining the now famous line that silver, or money, was of no value in Solomon's time. It was as common as the dust of the earth.
Again, Solomon also featuring prominently in Freemasonry. And if you've seen my Kabbala lectures, you will have seen that these texts take on alternate interpretations often. So you may think, well, this interpretation's a bit of a reach. Oh, David's singing to it, sound waves, stuff like that, or frequencies altering the structure of minerals or metals, etc., etc. We are going to continue to develop this thesis, and this is only the introductory video to this concept. Okay, so I'm not explaining everything in this one video, but they consistently have taken large jumps in their reasoning and reinterpretation of these texts over the years. So this is how we get to this point in time where we're going back and looking at their potential Kabbalistic interpretation of these events. Again, we're building towards something here.
This image of David perfecting the moon through music is also just kind of lovely. Again, showing how in the Zohar's imagination, not only does influence rain down from the heavens, but also human activity can transform the heavenly, even the divine world itself. A really fascinating idea about the parallel flow of divine.
This is the reason why they view rituals as so important, and why they view their own actions as being so divine, and we're the ones that are saving the world type of stuff. And the other aspect to this is the concept of apotheosis, or salvation. And so ultimately they have, with their belief system, so you had the messianism idea, the messianic idea that a Messiah is going to come and save us all. But now with Kabbala, you have our own actions. What we do is necessary and justified. And it's sort of an end justify the means sort of concept. We're justified in everything that we do. Our actions are going to bring about the Messiah. You can easily see how this lends itself to narcissism, because they literally are saying that our own rituals are changing the heavenly realm above us. Our actions down here, and by our, I'm referring to the Jews here, or the Kabbalists specifically, not every Jew, but this is Jewish mysticism ultimately. And again, very much like an alchemical process, we're going to alter the structure of reality, just like the alchemist, once again, is trying to alter the structure of a metal into a more purified form. And you could also think of this in other terms as, well, if they're trying to purify or sanctify certain things, if it's Sabbatean Frankists, then they might be trying to degenerate and degrade certain things. Or maybe they're trying to purify themselves, meaning the Jews, and do the reverse to the other races, encourage degeneracy, thinking of things like Jews being foremost in producing pornography, things like encouraging interracial relationships, not saying that that's the same thing as pornography, but there's this concept of the mixed multitudes or the Eruvav and things of that nature, which do feature in Kabbala, or promoting practices that don't generate human life, like homosexual behavior, etc., etc. But ultimately, they're viewing it as their own actions are what is changing the events and potentially even the structure of the universe itself.
Energy. Of course, Kabbala and alchemy would continue to interact in the centuries following the publication of the Sefer Zohar. Hebrew translations of various alchemical texts also show a very strong Jewish interest in alchemy as well. Though this should be pretty unsurprising. As early as Pseudo-Democritus and Zosimus of Panopolis, Jewish interest in alchemy was well established. Zosimus really attributed a lot of alchemical wisdom to the Jewish people. And of course, Miriam the prophetess was also, well, Jewish, Maria the Jewess. Of all the texts which combine alchemy and Kabbalah, I'd like to argue that none are more technically or theoretically thorough as the Eish Metzaref, or the refiner's fire. The text is a reference taken from Malachi 3 in the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to use the Hebrew name here because the name Malachi just has serious Children of the Corn vibes for me. And also, Malachi is much more likely to be a title than a name. It's something like my messenger or even my angel. Children of the Corn aside, we're told there's going to be a coming messianic figure who will, quote, sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. He will purify the sons of Levi and refine them like gold and silver.
Again, you can see very quickly how this lends itself to the idea of a messianic figure, someone from the line of David, right? A Jew from the line of David will sit on the throne at the end of time, blah, 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 blah.
V'yashav metzaref kesef v'tichar b'nei Levi v'zakakotam kazahav v'chakasef. Again, the idea of purification and rectification being themes in both Kabbalah and alchemy. The text itself is anonymous, and sadly the Hebrew original has been lost. It apparently survived in an Italian edition, which has also been lost, but was rendered into Latin and published in the first volume of Christian Noor van Rosenroth's monumental text, Kabbala Denudata, or the Kabbalah Uncovered in 1677. Though even in the Kabbala Denudata, the text is spliced and kind of shuffled around. And even while the text is published in 1677, dating the original isn't easy.
So if you are interested in this topic, this is where you can find this book, The Jewish Alchemist, A History and Source Book. And this was retrieved from libgen.is. You can see the URL above here if you're interested in getting a PDF of that.
From internal evidence, it seems clear that the author knew the 1548 Pardes Rimonim of Moshe Cordovero, but not so much the Lurianic Kabbalah, which more or less supplanted the Cordoveran system. So we can kind of tentatively date the Eish Metzaref to the later half of the 16th century, but it could have really been any time between then and 1677 with the publication of Kabbala Denudata. They have to emulate the prophet Elisha in his disdain for worldly wealth, thus becoming like the primeval nature, or tohu, empty and void, thus able to receive the dual wisdom of both Kabbalah and alchemy. Of course, we're reminded that both Elisha's name and the word tohu are equal to 411, which may be information for some of you. Further, we're told that the divine system of the 10 Sephirot, or the divine emanations, appear at all levels of reality, from the apex of reality in the realm of pure emanation, or Atzilut, to the lowest world of Asiya, or becoming, or action. Thus, even in our world, the divine emanations are expressed or reflected in the natures of the various metals. We're told that corresponding to the divine hiddenness of Keter, we find the occult substratum of all metals, which never appears as itself in itself. From this occult root metal flows lead for Chokmah, tin for Binah, silver for Chesed, gold for Gevurah, iron for Tiferet, Netzach and Hod represent a kind of androgyne brass, and Yesod with its watery, seminal quicksilver, and Malchut is linked with nothing less than the Philosopher's Stone, or as the text puts it, the true medicine of the metals.
Now, all of these parts of the Sephiroth that he just referenced, and the transsexual and homosexual esoteric lectures, I pointed out that all those parts of the Sephiroth correspond to different regions of the human body. And he kind of touches on that when he mentions Yesod, and it essentially references male reproductive region, and Malchut, which references the anus. Sorry, that's the only way to phrase it. So these different metals are associated in the system with these different elements of the Sephiroth. And of course, we know that electromagnetic fields as well are associated with different properties when exposed to metals and things of that nature. And we know that different systems in the body are responsive to electromagnetic fields because they have iron containing or ferromagnetic properties, right? I've covered this in previous lectures. So again, we're building on this intersection of these ideas to see how and why Kabbalists would use electromagnetic fields against the rest of us.
Interestingly enough, another schema is also briefly introduced but never really discussed, in which mercury, salt, and sulfur are identified with Keter, Chokmah, and Binah, while the lower 7 Sephiroth reflect the other metals. This seems to actually reflect a kind of Paracelsian variant on this Kabbalistic alchemy, which is really fascinating. Apparently, the author was familiar with both systems and seems to be attempting to show that Kabbala is fundamentally amenable to both alchemical systems, Paracelsian and traditional. It's a kind of ecumenical attitude that would have had absolutely enraged the dogmatically anti-dogmatic Paracelsus. From here, the text continues to imagine the Kabbalist alchemist as a kind of doctor who repairs the metaphysical world through righteous deeds as informed by the Kabbalah, but also who heals nature itself through the application of alchemy. Conspicuously missing in the ESOTERIC is much emphasis on substantial transmutation. That is, the age-old attempt to make gold or silver from base metals. Rather, the ESOTERIC is much more interested in the theoretical integration of Kabbalah and alchemy as a way of understanding nature and healing it, to use the language of the text. Of course, armed with Kabbalah and alchemy, this healing, to use that language, could take the form of substantial transmutation, but the author never really seems to emphasize it. It's basically kind of an afterthought. Of course you can make lead into gold, but what's really important for the ESOTERIC is understanding the very deep substructure of reality and healing it. From here, the text takes up a survey of the various metals, exploring their natures through Kabbalistic analysis, especially gematria, in which Hebrew words are read as numbers and connections are found at this deeper mathematical or numerological level. For instance, we learn that the divine name El is tied specifically to silver, and by extension, the name El Chai, the living God, is the same as Kesef Chai, or living silver, both of which are tied to Chochav, the Hebrew word for the planet Mercury and just the word for star in general. They're all equal to the number 49. Of course, this is all linked back to the famed messianic verse there in Numbers 24:17, and a star shall arise out of Jacob, thus revealing both the messianic, redemptive, and transformative power of Mercury and alchemy. Just in the same way that the Kabbalists read the Bible to reveal hidden truths about the Sephirotic vitality and dynamism within the Godhead, the author of the ESOTERIC similarly transforms the Bible and Kabbalistic literature more generally into a kind of elaborate alchemical text.
And I always find that interesting when he's referencing mercury there. And of course, mercury was in vaccines for an extended period of time. And then it became about thimerosal and all these different sorts of derivatives. But he's mentioning here gematria, and that's the sort of numerical system by which they're interpreting these events or concepts and converting letters into numbers and associating that with different things, okay, in these systems. And so we have already established that they had a system for doing this gematria process, this Kabbalistic process with metals. So because these numbers also lend themselves to certain frequencies, once again, you can kind of see where I'm heading with this.
Each of the various alchemical metals are given a similar Kabbalistic analysis. One highlight worth pointing out in a long, somewhat complicated analysis of Hebrew words for lion is that we learned that kafir, the word for a young lion or a lion cub, is connected with the word yerek, the word for greenness, as both have the value of 310 in gematria. Of course, this is a wonderful reference to the most famous alchemical image of all time, the green lion. This substance, which is probably some combination of nitric and hydrochloric acids, or aqua regia, is capable of attacking gold and produces a kind of greenish tint as it does so. Hence, all the images of the green lion attacking the sun in so much alchemical art. Here, in the ESOTERIC, we can add a Kabbalistic analysis of this most famous alchemical process. Finally, there's an interesting adjunct of magic to the text as well. I mean, we're doing alchemy and Kabbala, we might as well add magic and make it esotericer. At any rate, several of the Kabbalistic metal analyses also contain magical squares which represent the metals in question. The author of the ESOTERIC refers to these as kamayot, or kamia in the singular. This is the word for a magical amulet in Hebrew. For instance, we're given what is perhaps the single most famous magical square after the famed Sator square, and that's the square for the planet Jupiter and the metal tin. Of course, this square is famous for appearing in both Albrecht Dürer's 1514 Melancholia, where it's likely being used there to magically reverse just that Saturnic state. Of course, it also importantly occurs in the second of Cornelius Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy. Here, in the ESOTERIC, the author links the Hebrew word for tin, badil, with the number 34 in a kind of gematria pun on the Hebrew word dal, which means poor. I think, or I suppose, pointing to the poor value of tin. Several other kamayot are also given, some appearing in Agrippa and others not. Just where the author of the ESOTERIC obtained or generated these word square amulets isn't clear, but again, a fascinating magical connection to both Dürer and Agrippa. The ESOTERIC ends with an analysis of sulfur and concludes with a kind of Kabbalistic alchemical quotation from the book of Proverbs. But a treasure and oil are found among the wise. Of course, the treasure here could be riches, the result of alchemical transmutation, but I think it's more likely wisdom given the overall tenor of this text. Oil also has a connotation of luxury, but also has a kind of messianic image, perhaps pointing to the power of Kabbala and alchemy to do the work of cosmic and natural healing, transmutation, and redemption. The ESOTERIC is a fascinating text weaving Kabbala, alchemy, and magic together into an analysis more fundamentally interested in understanding and healing nature than in creating riches in the form of gold and silver. In this way, it's much closer to the kind of spiritual alchemy that interests more modern people. The ESOTERIC is preserved in Christian Noor van Rozenrath's monumental Kabbala Denudata, or the Kabbala Uncovered, that was published in 1677. I've included a link in the description below to the entire first volume in digital form in Latin. Unfortunately, no English edition of this entire text has ever been produced, which isn't surprising considering it is gigantic. And further, sections which have been translated into English are, let's call them, unreliable. Luckily, Raphael Patai has translated basically the entire text. He doesn't render the long quotations from the Zohar, but he does give you the references in the standard Aramaic edition if you want to look those up, or cross-reference them with the Pritzker Zohar, which is the only English edition of the Zohar I really recommend. And these are all given with incredibly helpful notes in chapter 26 of his very important volume, The Jewish Alchemists. Unsurprisingly, it's in a book about Jewish alchemy. So if you want to read the text in detail, I would consult it there. This text is also extremely helpful because the Eish Metzaref isn't presented in the Kabbala Danudata as one continuous text, but it's sort of broken up into pieces.
Now, I showed you where to find this text. So we've effectively merged the ideas of Kabbala with alchemy without too much difficulty. And we've established that these esoteric traditions, including Kabbala and all these other systems, were very much aware of the power and usage of using electromagnetic fields. So briefly, I want to show just how influential Jews have been in this field as it relates to physics and our understanding of it, and how they have basically, in many cases, mirrored Kabbalistic principles. Briefly, before I start talking specifically about Kabbala in direct relation to electromagnetic fields, a potential source for that, just as a primer, and then we'll look at directly at the research, because I want to expose the implications of what it is that we're talking about here. And of course, who is essential in sort of the modern era of carrying our understanding of physics and a lot of these fields, this sort of search for a grand unified field theory that combines all these forces. Well, Albert Einstein, the famous E equals MC squared guy, right? And of course, his parents were secular Ashkenazi Jews, Hermann Einstein, salesman and engineer, and Pauline Koch. Then they moved to Munich's borough in 1880 when Einstein's father and uncle Jacob founded Elektrotechnische Fabrik, a company that manufactured electrical equipment based on direct current. The Jewish Einstein's father was working on direct current, and of course, we know sort of the conflict between Tesla. There's many quotes about Tesla on Einstein, where he basically argues that this guy is not that great. And many people have made the same arguments. If you type Einstein plagiarist in the archive. Again, I'm not saying I agree with everything all of these authors. I'm just saying if you're interested, there's many people at the time and after the fact that said Einstein's a plagiarist or Einstein's ideas don't hold weight. Yet he's literally the most famous scientist of all time and hailed as this magnificent genius. And the question is that because his ideas are necessarily 100% accurate, or is that because they were useful to the agenda that would subsequently be developed? And of course, we have the father of the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer, and he was also a non-observant Jewish family in New York, painter, a successful textile importer. His brother Frank became a physicist, etc., etc. And there's extended connections to Oppenheimer. But the managers of our physics, and again, there's lots of information that one could look up about the atomic bomb and the questions as to the development of that weapon and what it actually is we're looking at when we're seeing atomic test footage. Again, you can discuss those ideas on your own. That's not the purpose of this lecture. But our forming of what's potentially possible as it relates to physics is dictated by yet another Jew. And then we fast forward to string theory, which is this hailed as this magnificent thing, and there's problems with the quantum model stuff too, which has now progressed to string theory. And one of the fathers of string theory, of course, is Leonard Susskind, born to a Jewish family from the South Bronx in New York City. He began working as a plumber from the age of 16, taking over for his father, who had become ill. He later enrolled in the City College of New York as an engineering student, graduated with a BS in physics. And for those that have followed this, he's the guy that pushes the holographic principle and the string theory stuff. So the holographic principle is that, the universe is really a hologram. This is all just a simulation. And where does that fit in well with? Well, it fits in well with Darwinism, and it fits in well with the Talmud, because if you think that none of this is real, then none of this matters, and there's no reason to fight back against the Jews that are oppressing you. If you're convinced at the universe level that none of this is actually significant, it's all just a simulation, much like his Jewish compatriot Robert Sapolsky teaches that we don't have free will. So this is a meta-level reinterpretation that Jews, in the form of Susskind, have advanced this theory to convince the Gentile world that the world they're living in isn't even real, which would more mirror the teachings of the text of Kabbala. So they've manipulated the sciences in order to pull a veil over the eyes of the non-Jewish community. So we've expanded above and beyond radio waves telling fictional stories. We've extended above and beyond false flag events and the spin of news agencies that are largely Jewish controlled. We've extended above and beyond video games and even the virtual reality stuff, because even if you're outside of that, they're telling you that this world isn't actually real. We're all just a collection of impulses, right? Just like the Talmud predicts that non-Jews are essentially non-human, and many other Jewish texts assert the same thing. Rabbi Lubavitch saying that Gentiles come from the demonic spheres, etc., etc. So we're only indirectly animated by light for our existence, and once that light is removed, which light features prominently in this entire discussion, our existence will be removed. If you've followed string theory, you'll realize that many people have stated that this is a bankrupt idea, and the predictions of string theory have not yielded useful results. Yet it's still, in many circles, treated as fact and not theory, and based on its holographic principle predictions and all these many dimensions that the string is supposed to exist upon, which you can trace back to Kabbalistic ideas which talk about all these different dimensions that this string is supposedly operating on. Once again, well, our third dimension is insignificant when you need the 11 dimensions of string theory or something to that effect. It's several different dimensions that are required in order for string theory to work. And when you try to extrapolate that out to a useful physical model that produces tangible, useful physical results, it doesn't. It hasn't been fruitful. Yet this Jewish figure, once again, is praised as a result of this. I just want to highlight that our own physics has been co-opted by these Jewish thinkers in opposition to their ideas, and individuals that critique them or point out the lack of innovation circulating around people taking and accepting these ideas as fact has in many ways crippled us scientifically. And it's all situated around these ideas of these fields, both electromagnetic and other types of fields. With Oppenheimer, it's sort of these molecular fields and the shell model and all this kind of stuff. But they've literally conditioned the way that we think about physical reality, and in my opinion, moved us further away from what's actually. So now we need to bring this explicitly back to Kabbala. So we know Kabbala functions alchemically. We know that these esoteric traditions were familiar with electromagnetic fields. And now I'm just going to touch on this because this is meant to be an introduction to this topic. The link between the ideas of gematria and electromagnetic fields and Kabbala and all this kind of stuff. Where this intersects. You can find this online, this resource that I'm showing you right now. The URL is right here, KabbalaSecrets.com, the ultimate reality behind the universe. Obviously, I do not agree that Kabbala is the ultimate reality behind the universe. I am making the argument that, in fact, Kabbalistic ideas and thoughts are literally destroying the sciences because individuals that have Kabbalistic aspirations, whether they are aware or not, are setting up experiments or even falsifying results to try to make the universe fit these principles so they can justify their belief system. again, think about the strings theory stuff that I just showed you with Leonard Susskind, who's Jewish, etc., etc. Now, in this book, there's a chapter, and there's previous chapters to this one, discussing electricity. And the first chapter, magnetism and the Aleph. And so in it, we see there's multiple times over that they utilize gematria, or the study of these numbers. Just like we saw gematria coding with the alchemy stuff in that, look at that one video on Kabbala and alchemy. To say, oh, well, this number is a holy number because this thing, and then they run it through the Jewish gematria system, and it says this, and they use the dimensions of the temple for a lot of this stuff. And as we saw with the Manly P. Hall lecture, they were literally using specific geometric shapes therapeutically. And this is where I think Masonry just organically lent itself really well to the practices of Kabbalists, because you have this sort of sacred geometry idea, and the stonemasons, of course, are the square and compass, and they're making these sacred shapes and things like that. And there's many examples of the Fibonacci sequence in nature, which does have validity to it. I'm not saying that this stuff doesn't have some validity to it. I'm saying the interpretive framework, the Kabbalistic framework, in which these observed patterns is interpreted, is dangerous, problematic, and ultimately leading us toward a road that we don't want to go down. So in this section, they discuss, the planes of existence and where light comes in and goes out, and they're discussing this in the context of the temple. So here you have plan of the third temple. Now, for those that are familiar with sort of Old and New Testament prophecy and are aware of Jewish history, it was a profound event in Jewish history when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And a big part of the Jewish prophetic tradition is that the temple will be reconstructed. And there's all these sort of prophetic ideas around that. So the dimensions of the temple represent a form of sacred geometry. And so these dimensions include, of course, numbers, and these numbers could potentially be associated with specific frequencies. We're going to return to this book. This is meant as an introduction to this topic that we're going to continue to expand on in more detail, but explicitly the geometry that we've talked about, the Kabbalistic principles and the alchemical principles that we talked about intersect with gematria, and those all intersect with practices using electromagnetic fields. The Kabbalists reference those same traditions that Manly P. Hall was talking about with the Egyptians and stuff using staffs and wands with the electromagnetic fields. The Kabbalists reference many of those same practices, and many of these other esoteric traditions do. So explicitly, there is a Kabbalistic model and interpretive framework for electricity and electromagnetic fields. We're not going into big detail on this chapter, but they discuss the gematria number associated with creation and Adam Kadmon and the Moshiach, their Messiah. They all have gematria numbers associated with them, and these can be potentially interpreted with different frequencies. Again, you can see where I'm headed with this, but before I go too woo-woo with this stuff, let's look at the actual scientific studies on some of these specific electromagnetic frequencies that we're talking about here, because I want you to have an understand of where I'm trying to take this stuff and why it matters above and beyond speculative, why it matters in the real world when I'm talking about, well, there's all these deceptive practices and electromagnetic fields fit in, but where's the practical application part? Well, let's demonstrate that.